Picture this. You're standing in a frozen valley 20,000 years ago. The wind is doing that thing where it cuts through every layer you're wearing like your clothes are made of wet paper. And 40 feet away, something is watching you. It weighs as much as a school bus. Its tusks are longer than you are tall, and you are holding a stick. That's it. That's the plan. A stick, a sharpened rock tied to the end of it, and a group of guys who smell like smoke and desperation. And somehow, against every ounce of logic your brain is screaming at you right now, this is going to work. Somehow, humans without metal, without guns, without so much as a decent pair of boots, took down animals that could have squashed them without even noticing. So how? How does a 5-foot-something primate with soft skin and no claws decide the mammoth is on the menu tonight? Stick around, because the answer is way weirder and way smarter than they got lucky. Let's set the stage properly, because the world our ancestors were hunting in was basically a fantasy movie. This was the Ice Age, and it wasn't just cold, it was stuffed with monsters. We're talking woolly mammoths standing 11 feet at the shoulder, giant ground sloths the size of a small elephant, with claws like the world's worst garden tool. Short-faced bears that could look a grizzly in the eye and make the grizzly reconsider its life choices. Saber-toothed cats with canine teeth like kitchen knives. Giant beavers the size of a black bear for some reason, because evolution apparently panics sometimes. And glyptodonts, which were basically armored tanks with a face dragging around a shell the size of a small car. This was the world. Everything was bigger, meaner, and significantly more likely to end your day badly. And into this world walked a species with none of the natural weapons any of these creatures had. No claws worth mentioning, no fangs, no armor, no fur thick enough to survive a bad afternoon, let alone a Siberian winter. On paper, humans should have been a snack, a light one. But here's the twist nobody talks about enough. While every other animal in that ecosystem was busy evolving bigger teeth or thicker hide, humans were evolving something far more dangerous. A brain that could plan 3 steps ahead, a body built for stamina instead of raw power, and hands that could turn a rock into a weapon. That combination turned out to be the actual apex predator trait of the Ice Age. Not muscle, strategy. Let's actually pause on that brain part for a second because it matters more than people realize. It wasn't just about being clever in the moment, it was about being clever across generations. A wolf figures out how to hunt through instinct baked in by millions of years of evolution. A human figures out how to hunt through stories, through watching an uncle mess up and lose a toe to frostbite, through remembering that 3 winters ago the herd crossed the river right around this time of year. That kind of knowledge doesn't come from instinct. It comes from language, memory, and the simple, stubborn habit of teaching your kids everything you know before you die. Every successful mammoth hunt was really the end product of hundreds of failed hunts that came before it, each one teaching the tribe a little more. So let's talk about the first trick up humanity's sleeve, because it's the one most people get completely wrong. Everyone imagines a caveman charging a mammoth head-on, spear raised, screaming like it's the climax of an action movie. In reality, that would have gotten you killed in about 4 seconds, and probably would have been the last mistake you ever made. Real hunters didn't fight fair. They didn't fight at all, really, not in the way we think of a fight. They fought smart, and smart usually meant the animal never even saw it coming. One of the oldest and most brutally effective techniques was the pit trap. Dig a deep hole along a game trail, disguise the top with branches and grass, and wait. A mammoth doesn't need to be killed by a spear if gravity and a broken leg do the job for you. Once an animal that size is stuck in a pit, injured, panicking, and unable to get proper leverage, suddenly a handful of humans with spears aren't fighting a monster anymore. They're finishing off something that's already lost. And this is where the humor of the situation kicks in, because think about the sheer audacity of that plan. You're basically betting your entire meal plan on the idea that an animal with a brain the size of a basketball is going to walk in a straight line, on the one path you happened to dig a hole in at the exact time you're ready. It sounds like a plan a cartoon coyote would draw up, except it worked. Again and again for tens of thousands of years across multiple continents. Turns out predictability is a universal weakness, whether you're a mammoth or a guy checking his phone while crossing the street. Digging one of these pits wasn't a quick afternoon project either. Without metal shovels, hunters were digging into frozen or semi-frozen ground using antler picks, wooden digging sticks, and sheer patience. Some of these traps took days to prepare. And that's before you even factor in disguising the opening well enough to fool an animal that had presumably survived plenty of dangerous terrain already. This wasn't laziness dressed up as cleverness. It was an investment. A community would spend real time and real effort setting a trap that might not pay off for weeks, on the gamble that eventually, some unlucky giant would take exactly the wrong step at exactly the wrong moment. But pits alone don't explain everything. Ancient humans had a second weapon that might be even more underrated than the pit trap, and it's something you use every single day without thinking about it: geography. Terrain was a weapon long before anyone forged metal. Hunters would drive herds of animals toward cliffs, river crossings, or narrow canyons, essentially turning the landscape itself into the killing blow. There are sites in North America where archaeologists have found piles of bison bones stacked at the base of cliffs, evidence of what's now called a buffalo jump. Entire herds stampeded off the edge by coordinated groups of hunters working in terrifyingly good teamwork, long before spreadsheets or walkie-talkies existed. Now, giant ground sloths and mammoths weren't quite as easy to stampede off a cliff as a herd of bison, but the same underlying principle applied everywhere. Use the land. Use fear. Use the animal's own instincts against it. A mammoth trying to escape a group of shouting, torch-waving humans doesn't think clearly. It runs. And if that run happens to be funneled toward a swamp, a steep slope, or a river with unstable banks, the animal does most of the work of killing itself. This is also where fire enters the picture, and honestly, fire might be the single most underrated tool in the entire ancient arsenal. Forget spears for a second. Fire could herd, fire could terrify, fire could be used to drive animals for miles in a chosen direction without a single weapon being thrown. Torches waved at the edges of a herd could push mammoths, bison, or giant elk toward exactly the trap hunters wanted them in. It's crowd control, prehistoric style, except the crowd weighs 6 tons and has tusks. Fire also solved a problem that had nothing to do with hunting directly, but made everything else possible. Cooking meat made it far easier to digest, which meant more calories from every kill, which meant fewer hunts were needed to keep a group alive through a brutal winter. Fire kept predators away from camp at night, letting people actually sleep instead of taking shifts on watch duty against a curious cave lion. And fire, in an odd roundabout way, probably gave early humans more free time to sit around and talk, plan, and pass down exactly the kind of hunting knowledge that made all these other tactics possible in the first place. Every clever trap and every daring ambush owes a small debt to a campfire somewhere that let a tired hunter rest, eat, and think clearly enough to plan the next attempt. Alright, let's talk about the weapon everyone actually associates with this era, because it deserves its reputation: the spear. Except the spear ancient humans used wasn't some crude sharpened stick you're picturing. By the time humans were regularly hunting megafauna, spear technology had gone through serious upgrades. Fire-hardened tips, precisely napped stone points, some so sharp modern researchers have cut themselves handling 15,000-year-old blades. And most importantly, an invention that might be the real secret weapon of the entire Ice Age: the atlatl. If you've never heard of an atlatl, picture a stick with a hook on one end, used to launch a spear like a lever, essentially turning your arm into a much longer, much more powerful arm. Using an atlatl, a hunter could launch a spear with roughly double or even triple the force and distance of a spear thrown by hand alone. Suddenly, you didn't need to get within arm's reach of an animal that could turn you into a stain. You could hit it from 20, 30, even 40 feet away, with enough force to punch through thick hide. This changed absolutely everything about the risk involved. Hunting a mammoth up close is basically a coin flip on your survival. Hunting a mammoth from 30 feet away with a weapon that hits like a compact car changes the odds dramatically in your favor. And once you understand the atlatl, this ridiculous mismatch between tiny human and giant beast starts making a lot more sense. Humans weren't trying to win a fair fight. They were making sure the fight was never fair to begin with, just tilted in the opposite direction from what nature intended. There's also something almost artistic about the stone points these hunters were making. Archaeologists have found entire categories of spear points, given names like Clovis points in North America, that show a level of craftsmanship that seems almost unreasonable for people living in caves and animal hide tents. Perfectly symmetrical, expertly flaked on both sides, with a small groove at the base specifically designed to make the point easier to attach to a wooden shaft. These weren't random rocks smashed into a point. They were the result of skilled tool makers, probably some of the most respected members of any given tribe, spending hours shaping stone with nothing but another stone and an enormous amount of patience. Now here's where things get genuinely clever, and where the humor really writes itself, because taking down one of these animals wasn't a one-man job, and it definitely wasn't a one-shot job. This is a coordinated operation, closer to a military ambush than a solo hunting trip. Groups of hunters, sometimes a dozen or more, would surround an animal from multiple angles using distraction and noise to keep it disoriented while others moved in from blind spots. Some hunters would have thrown spears from a distance using the atlatl, weakening the animal over time, while others waited with heavier thrusting spears for the moment it was finally exhausted enough to approach. And exhausted is the key word here, because one of humanity's greatest natural advantages was something almost embarrassingly simple. Humans are ridiculously good at not stopping. We are, pound for pound, some of the best endurance athletes on the planet. Not the fastest, not the strongest, but we can sweat efficiently, breathe efficiently, and keep moving for hours in ways that most four-legged predators simply cannot. A cheetah can outrun you for 30 seconds and then needs a nap. A wolf pack can chase you down over a mile or two before giving up. But a human, jogging steadily, drinking water, taking breaks in shade, can keep pace with an animal for hours until that animal is so overheated and exhausted it can barely stand. This is called persistence hunting, and it might be one of the most quietly terrifying facts about our species. We didn't need to be faster than a mammoth. We just needed to be more stubborn than it. And stubbornness, it turns out, might be humanity's oldest superpower. While the giant sloth or bison or mammoth is trying to conserve energy and cool down. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. A group of humans just keeps walking, keeps following, keeps closing the gap, hour after hour, until the animal's legs are shaking and its lungs are burning and there's nowhere left to run because running is the one thing it can no longer physically do. At that point, even a creature with tusks the size of surfboards is basically finished. Exhausted muscle doesn't care how big you are. Part of what makes persistence hunting work so well comes down to something surprisingly mundane: our sweat glands. Most large animals cool down mainly through panting, which means they have to slow down or stop entirely to release heat effectively. Humans, on the other hand, are covered in sweat glands and relatively free of thick fur, which means we can cool ourselves down while still moving at a steady pace. It sounds like a small evolutionary detail, barely worth mentioning, right up until you realize it might be one of the quiet reasons our species ended up at the top of the food chain instead of somewhere in the middle of it. Let's pause on the giant ground sloth for a second, because this animal deserves more attention than it usually gets. Some species stood over 10 feet tall with claws that could tear open tree trunks. And yet, archaeological evidence, including footprint trackways found in places like White Sands in New Mexico, shows something extraordinary. Preserved in ancient mud are the footprints of giant sloths walking in circles, seemingly evading a group of human footprints that surrounded them. Matching the pattern of exactly the kind of coordinated harassment tactic we've been talking about, it's basically a fossilized highlight reel of an actual hunt tens of thousands of years old, showing humans working together to box in an animal roughly the size of a small elephant using teamwork instead of brute force. It's astonishingly detailed evidence for something this ancient, and it lines up perfectly with everything researchers have theorized for decades. Imagine being the person who first noticed those tracks, brushing away dust in the desert sun and slowly realizing you're looking at a moment frozen in time, a life or death standoff between a group of humans and a giant sloth that played out tens of thousands of years before anyone thought to write anything down. No names, no dates, just footprints circling each other in ancient mud, telling a story more vivid than most written records ever could. Now, you might be wondering, with weapons this rudimentary and animals this enormous, how much of an impact could early humans possibly have had on these species overall? And this is where we get into one of the most fascinating and honestly kind of unsettling debates in all of paleontology. It's called the overkill hypothesis, and it suggests that human hunting wasn't just a survival tactic. It may have been one of the driving forces behind the extinction of dozens of megafauna species across the globe. Here's the pattern that got researchers' attention in the first place. Across almost every continent, the timeline of megafauna extinction lines up suspiciously well with the timeline of human arrival. In Australia, giant kangaroos, enormous flightless birds, and a car-sized wombat relative called Diprotodon all vanished not long after humans showed up on the continent. In North America, mammoths, giant sloths, saber-toothed cats, and a whole ecosystem of massive animals disappeared within a few thousand years of humans crossing over from Asia. Meanwhile, in Africa, where humans and megafauna evolved alongside each other for millions of years, giving animals time to learn caution around us, far more of these giant species survived into the modern era. That last detail is the part that really gets researchers talking because it suggests something almost eerie. In places where animals had time to evolve a fear of humans, they adapted, and many species survived. In places where humans showed up suddenly, as a completely new threat the local wildlife had never encountered, entire ecosystems of giants collapsed in a geological blink of an eye. Some scientists argue climate change played the larger role, since many of these extinctions overlap with the end of the last ice age and dramatic shifts in habitat. Others argue it was a 1-2 punch. Climate stress weakening populations while human hunting delivered the finishing blow to species already struggling to adapt. The debate is far from settled, and honestly, that's part of what makes this era of history so gripping. We're not just talking about ancient trivia. We're talking about one of the biggest mysteries in the story of life on this planet, and the evidence is still being pieced together, sometimes literally, bone by bone, out of frozen ground and ancient riverbeds. It's also worth pointing out that these animals reproduced painfully slowly compared to smaller species. A mammoth might take over a decade to reach breeding age, and even then, only produce a single calf every few years. That kind of slow reproductive cycle works fine in a world with no serious predators threatening adult populations. It becomes a massive vulnerability the moment a new intelligent predator shows up and starts picking off adults faster than new calves can replace them. You don't need to hunt every single mammoth on the planet to wipe out the species. You just need to hunt slightly faster than they can reproduce, and over a few thousand years, the math simply stops working in the animal's favor. But whatever the ultimate cause, the fact remains almost unbelievable when you sit with it. A species without claws, without natural armor, without any of the biological weaponry evolution typically hands out to apex predators may have played a leading role in wiping out some of the largest land animals to ever walk the earth. Not through overwhelming force, through overwhelming cleverness, patience, and cooperation. And that, more than any single spear or trap, might be the real story here. Ancient humans didn't beat giants because they were stronger. They beat giants because they were better at thinking as a group. Every single tactic we've talked about today, the pits, the cliffs, the fire, the atlatl, the persistence hunting, the surrounding and exhausting, none of it works with just one person. It only works when a dozen people trust each other enough to hold their position, wait for a signal, and move together like a single organism. That kind of coordination requires language, planning, memory, and an almost supernatural level of trust in the people standing next to you with their own sharpened stick, hoping the mammoth charges the other way. In a very real sense, the spear was never the real weapon. The real weapon was the tribe. It's worth remembering, too, that this wasn't some rare, occasional event. This was daily life for tens of thousands of years. Generation after generation of humans grew up learning these techniques from their parents, refining them, passing down which terrain worked best, which season the herds were weakest, how far a spear could really fly, how long a mammoth could be chased before its legs gave out. This knowledge, built entirely through trial and extremely dangerous error, was some of the most important information a Stone Age community could possess, because it was often the difference between a well-fed winter and a very grim one. Think about what a single successful mammoth hunt actually meant for a community back then. We're not just talking about a meal. A single mammoth could provide enough meat to feed dozens of people for weeks, along with fat that could be rendered down and stored, hide thick enough to build a shelter that could survive brutal winter winds, and bones long and sturdy enough to serve as structural beams for a dwelling. There are archaeological sites where entire huts were built almost exclusively out of mammoth bones, stacked and arranged with surprising architectural intention. One successful hunt wasn't just dinner. It was housing, clothing, tools, and survival all wrapped up in a single incredibly risky afternoon. And honestly, when you think about it that way, it makes the whole story a little more human. Not some superhuman legend of ancient warriors fearlessly slaying beasts, but ordinary people, cold, hungry, scared, working together because the alternative was worse. Facing down something the size of a house with nothing but sharpened rock and raw nerve, not because they were fearless, but because their kids needed to eat that winter. That's not a legend. That's just Tuesday if you happen to be born 40,000 years ago in the wrong, or honestly, the right place at the right time. There's also a quieter side to all of this worth sitting with for a moment. These hunts weren't risk-free triumphs every single time. Skeletal remains of ancient hunters occasionally show healed fractures, broken ribs, and injuries entirely consistent with being struck by a large, panicked animal. Some hunts almost certainly ended badly, with hunters injured or killed by the very creatures they were trying to bring down. Every successful hunt in the history books had, somewhere behind it, plenty of failed ones that cost someone dearly. The people telling these stories around the fire afterward weren't exaggerating for drama. They had genuinely just walked away from something that, by every reasonable measure, should have killed them. So next time you see a mammoth skeleton in a museum, or a giant sloth claw the size of your forearm sitting behind a pane of glass, take a second to really think about what that display isn't showing you. It isn't showing you the cold. It isn't showing you the fear. It isn't showing you a dozen people standing in freezing wind, spears in hand, watching a creature that could kill them all without even trying, and choosing to stand their ground anyway because somewhere back at camp people were counting on them. Somehow, some way, against every reasonable expectation biology should have set for us, that terrifying. Gamble worked out enough times to shape the entire world we live in now. The giants are gone. We're still here. And honestly, when you look at the size of some of those animals compared to us, that's not just a footnote in a history book. That might be one of the wildest survival stories evolution has ever produced. If you learned something today, or if you just really want to know how you'd personally fare against a saber-toothed cat with nothing but a sharpened stick, drop it in the comments because I have a feeling most of us wouldn't last 5 minutes out there. And if this kind of ancient survival story is your thing, there's a lot more where this came from. So stick around because the Ice Age still has plenty of secrets left to dig up.